Gunfire split the night. Isabella Monroe fell as rubble rained down. Bleeding, Sergeant Marcus Washington threw himself over her. "Stay alive, Isabella. Stay with me." The man she once despised was now the only one keeping her alive. The air tasted like ash and endings. Sirens wailed and then cut out, as if the city itself had lost the strength to scream. Where glass towers had once thrown sunlight across boulevards, charred ribs of steel clawed at a sky the color of bruises. Smoke drifted low, thick enough to sting the eyes and varnish the tongue. In that ruin, Isabella Monroe, thick, curvy, and impossibly polished even in catastrophe, pressed a silk scarf to her nose as though luxury might filter war. She had never stood in a line like this, not for bread, not for water, and certainly not to flee. The evacuation zone sprawled across what used to be a public square. Overturned fountains, scorched planters, and clusters of trembling people clutching bags that sagged with their last minutes of home. Isabella straightened the lapels of her cream blouse and lifted her chin. She told herself she was not like them. She'd come to this country for meetings and a gala, not to be herded toward a convoy as dusk bled into gunfire. "Ma'am, stay with your group," a soldier called, voice clipped. He was boyish, corn silk hair damp with sweat beneath his helmet. He pointed toward the center of the square. "Sergeant Washington will place you." Sergeant Washington. The name clicked through Isabella's head like a code she hadn't agreed to follow. She pivoted, scanning faces until her gaze snagged on him. He stood on the ribbed door of a transport truck, broad shoulders squared, dark skin sheened with heat, a hand lifted to direct the flow of bodies. Even from a distance, his presence gathered the chaos and gave it a spine. Men twice his age leaned in when he spoke. Civilians moved when his fingers cut the air. Isabella's mouth thinned. She did not like the impulse in her, the urge to obey a stranger who had not asked for her permission. She worked with men who sent emails and invoices, not commands. "No," she said to no one, adjusting the strap of her designer bag. "Someone else will help me." She turned to the blonde soldier, offering the gleam of a practiced smile. "I'll wait for your lieutenant." "Ma'am," he said, voice gentler now. "Sergeant Washington is the authority here." A rinse of heat, humiliation, anger fired up Isabella's neck. She swallowed it. She would not be managed by a man like him. Not tonight, not ever. The ground answered her with a sound older than language. The first boom folded the square in half. The second cracked the sky. Pressure slapped Isabella's ears, her vision pinwheeled into a whirl of sparks and dust. People shrieked, high animal sounds, then scattered, a flock blown apart by invisible predators. She tried to move, but the world tilted, listing like a ship. Her heel caught on broken stone. Gravity took her shoulders and spun her down. A body hit hers from the side, iron and speed. Arms wrapped around her, locking tight. Heat. Weight. A voice, close and unyielding. "Down." The ground leaped again under another blast, the air filled with grit. Isabella curled into the force pinning her, nails biting her palm, breath strangled by the scarf. The weight shifted, braced above her, and took the rain of debris with a grunt. Somewhere a child wailed. Somewhere a man shouted coordinates that meant survival to someone else. She felt herself moved, dragged, then tucked behind the base of a busted statue where the air didn't roar so loud. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a request. She blinked grit from her eyes and his face swum into shape. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw set like a line of command, eyes scanning past her as he shielded her with one forearm. Sergeant Washington. Up close he was larger than he had looked on the truck. Bulk from training, not vanity. A smear of ash cut a bright stripe across his temple. His breath came steady. His rifle lay still against his chest, held with easy intimacy as if it were another limb. "You didn't have to throw me," Isabella said, trying for crisp and landing somewhere near shaken. It put you behind cover in 2 seconds. His eyes flicked to hers, then passed. 2 seconds is the difference tonight. She hated that the ground beneath her seemed to level at the sound of his voice. I was told there were flights. There were. Then the trucks were hit. He angled his head, listening with his whole body. We're on Plan B. I was not informed of Plan B. Congratulations. You're being informed. Before she could summon the indignation to answer, bullets stitched the edge of a van to their left. Isabella flinched, feeling the stupidity of her posture, upright, visible, obvious. He pressed 2 fingers to her shoulder and eased her lower, the gesture paradoxically gentle given the steel in his tone. Keep your head down, Ms. Isabella Monroe. She almost added the names of companies, capitals, and donors as if those things could function as armor tonight. My plane doesn't matter, he finished for her, already rising into a half-crouch to peer around their cover. You matter. The next 10 minutes matter. Breathe. Breathe. As if she'd forgotten how. She dragged air past the smell of burning plastic and something sweetly rotten. A woman staggered by, sobbing. A boy with a torn shirt pressed both hands to the side of his neck where blood seeped in a bright, obscene river. Isabella's chest cinched. For heartbeat she hated everyone. The city, these gunshots, the sand in her teeth, the man telling her what to do. Mostly she hated the tremble in her own hands. Sergeant! A corporal skidded behind their slab of cover. South Block's compromised. We lost 2 drivers. Civilians panicked and ran past the line to the market road. We can't retrieve. Sergeant Washington's jaw flexed. We don't split. Pull Jensen to the rear, stagger the civilians by 2s, and we move along the wall. I want eyes on roofs and alleys. No cowboy heroics. He tapped his radio twice and spoke into it, his voice somehow quiet and audible over the noise. Orders rolled out of him with the clean logic of a map. The corporal glanced at Isabella, at her spotless blouse, her diamond studs, her city shoes, then back at the sergeant. What about... She's with us, he said, already leaning to scan the street again. She sticks to my 6. Isabella bristled at the pronoun before she recognized the relief underneath it. With us. Not alone, not discarded. The thought shocked her. She did not consider herself a person who needed to be kept. You will move when I move, he told her, eyes back on hers. You will not run ahead, you will not stop, you will not play hero. Do you understand? The word hovered on her tongue, no, buoyed by the old braids of habit and class. But the square answered with another crack, and a fist of force punched hot wind down the corridor of collapsed stalls. A rain of glass chimed against their slab. She swallowed. I understand. He nodded once and shifted, rising into a crouch that seemed to unspool strength from the ground. On me. They moved. The world collapsed into a narrow choreography, his hand signaling halt, his shoulder cutting left, her feet obeying before her mind quite caught up. Twice he stopped her with a palm pressed to the air. Twice she felt a bullet tear past a space her body would have occupied if not for that small interruption. Her heart slammed so hard she tasted copper. They slid along a wall mottled with smoke shadows until the square widened into a corridor framed by shuttered market stalls. A cluster of families huddled there, women with raw eyes, grandfathers clenching prayer beads, a teenage boy gripping a broken suitcase like a life preserver. Soldiers orbited them, forming and reforming a living wall as orders changed. Corporal Jensen, Washington called, and a young Marine jogged over, sharp and pale in the face. You lead the next element, 2 by 2, low profile, no chatter. If anyone freezes, you put them behind me and move the line. Jensen's gaze snagged on Isabella for half a second, something like irritation flitting across his features. Then he nodded and turned away, voice firming as he marshaled the civilians. Washington's attention clicked back to her. Shoes, he said. Excuse me? You're going to have to run. Those heels are going to betray you. They're not heels, she winced, hearing herself. Look, I can run. You can, he agreed. You'll run better without them. He was right, and she hated that he was right.
She towed off her expensive flats, winced at Grit bit her stockings, and shoved the shoes into her bag. The square vibrated again, a distant boom threaded by a closer rattle of automatic fire. The teenage boy's knuckles whitened on his suitcase handle. Isabella wanted to take his hand and didn't know how. "Ready?" Washington asked. "No." "Yes." He lifted 2 fingers. Jensen moved the first pair of civilians. Washington stepped, and Isabella stepped with him. They weaved between stalls, ducked beneath a crumpled metal awning, and crossed a gap where the moon poured silver onto shattered glass. A bullet pinged the awning. A woman stifled a scream with both fists in her mouth. Isabella's breath grew thin and fast. She focused on his back, the measured set of shoulders, the cadence of his stride, as if it were a metronome. Halfway down the corridor, the night changed shape. The shots shifted angle. Washington's head tilted infinitesimally, reading a sentence she could not see. He cut his hand low. "Stop." Isabella froze. He scanned the rooftops, eyes narrowing, then turned slightly. Down. She dropped with him, a heartbeat before the wall behind them coughed dust. The boy's suitcase burst open, clothes haloed the air. Washington rose into a firing stance, calm as breath, and returned 3 clean shots. A figure slumped on a dark ledge and disappeared. For a dizzying, humiliating moment, Isabella felt something new unfurl under her fear. Trust. Not the kind she wrote on contracts, not the kind that traded favors at charity dinners. The ancient kind. The kind that says, "Follow this voice and live." He looked back, measuring her in a second. "We're close. Stay tight." Close. The word loosened something in her chest. She nodded. He moved. She moved. Behind them, the square burned. Ahead, a narrow street glimmered with the promise of trucks and a fence, and beyond that, a road that might lead out of this nightmare. They reached the corner, and the night erupted again. A roar, closer than breath. Light like a door blown open. The shockwave lifted her off her feet. She saw him move. She saw his arms, saw the world somersault. Then stone, sky, and sound, stacked into darkness. And the only thing she knew was the press of his body over hers, shielding, insisting, refusing to let go.
The night pressed down heavy and merciless, broken only by the shudder of distant artillery. The city Isabella Monroe once called foreign and fascinating now felt like a tomb, its streets lined with skeletons of burnt-out cars and jagged shards of buildings. Every step through it was a reminder that this was no longer civilization, but survival. Isabella trudged in the middle of the group, sweat gluing silk to her skin, her once pristine blouse ruined with grime and blood she dared not name. She held her bag tight against her hip, as if it still tethered her to the world she had lost. Ahead, Sergeant Marcus Washington led them with the sharp precision of a man bred for battle. Every flick of his wrist commanded obedience. Every turn of his head swept the street for dangers she could not see. And every time Isabella's eyes caught on him, the old contempt rose like bile. It wasn't only him. It was men like him. Men she had been taught to ignore. Men who served as shadows in the backdrop of her privilege. Drivers, guards, janitors, soldiers. Necessary, but never respected. They were supposed to be the background, not the leader, not the one dictating her survival. Yet here she was, one of many, moving in lockstep because Marcus had ordered it so. She hated it. "Keep up, Monroe," a soldier barked behind her, the syllables sharp and clipped. Corporal Jensen, young, pale, jaw locked in irritation. His boots thudded impatiently as he trailed her. "You don't have time for you to drag your heels." "I am moving as fast as I can," Isabella snapped, lifting her chin. She had been reduced to marching like cattle, and she refused to be humiliated further by some boy with a gun. "Move faster," Jensen muttered. "Lay off, Jensen." The voice was Marcus's, calm but carrying authority that cut like steel. "She's keeping up." Jensen huffed, muttered something under his breath but fell silent. The others didn't challenge it. Even those who outranked Marcus deferred to him. Isabella noticed that, unwillingly. She noticed how his men trusted him without hesitation, how civilians clung to his presence like lifeboats in the storm. He wasn't just obeyed, he was followed. And that, more than the danger around them, unsettled her. The group moved through a corridor of ruins. Shadows bent long across the cracked pavement, turning every corner into a potential ambush. Marcus raised a fist. Everyone dropped low without question. Isabella hesitated, then mimicked them, hating how instinctively she looked to him. "Clear," he murmured after scanning the rooftops. His voice carried quiet certainty, the kind that made the ground feel steadier beneath her feet. They pressed on. It was Private Miller who broke the silence, his voice cutting through the night with bitter humor. "Still think you don't gotta listen to the black guy, Princess?" Isabella stiffened. Heat flushed up her neck. "I never said that." Miller snorted, shifting his rifle. "Didn't have to. We see it." Her mouth opened, then shut again. Words tangled in her throat. Because deep down she knew he was right. She hadn't trusted Marcus, not because of his orders, not because of the chaos, but because of what he was, because of what she had been taught to believe. Her chest burned with shame that tasted like acid. She wanted to argue, to insist she wasn't like that. But no defense came. The silence between her and Miller weighed heavier than the rifle slung across his chest. She looked ahead at Marcus. He hadn't said anything, hadn't turned, hadn't defended her, but his shoulders remained steady, his stride unwavering. He didn't need to say anything. He already knew. For the first time, Isabella felt the faintest crack in her certainty, a hairline fracture in a foundation she had never questioned. The night wore on in grinding steps. Civilians stumbled from exhaustion, but Marcus never slowed. When an elderly man collapsed, he knelt without hesitation and lifted him onto his back, bearing the weight as if it were nothing. When rations ran thin, he scoured an abandoned house and returned with enough food for every child in the group. Isabella watched, reluctant but unable to look away. She had thought men like him were brutes, all muscle, no mind. Yet here he was, mapping routes with careful logic, predicting threats with unnerving accuracy, protecting people who would never thank him. Her throat tightened with shame she didn't know how to name. Later, when they stopped to rest in the shadow of a crumbling wall, Isabella sat with her knees pulled to her chest, watching him. He crouched beside a wounded civilian, wrapping a bandage with steady hands. His face was focused, unreadable, illuminated by the flicker of a flashlight. Hours passed, and still he worked. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't drunk. He had given every resource to others. Isabella's fingers closed around the cool metal of her canteen. Her lips were dry, her throat raw, but she hadn't seen him take a sip of water all night. She swallowed. Then, hesitating longer than she should have, extended it towards him. Marcus looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. For a moment he didn't move. Then slowly he accepted it. No words, no thanks, just a single nod. It was enough. For the first time, Isabella didn't see him as a soldier. She saw him as a man. Hours later, the silence broke again. Gunfire erupted from rooftops, echoing through the alleyways with deafening force. Bullets sparked against stone, civilians screamed, and chaos fractured the group. Isabella ducked behind a toppled crate, hands trembling, breath shallow. She wanted to run, but her legs were fused. The world had turned into a storm of sound and fire. Marcus moved like water through the chaos, precise and unyielding. He pulled a teenager to safety, barked orders to his men, returned fire with steady control. Then the world snapped. A sharp crack, a grunt, and Marcus staggered. Blood seeped from his side. My stomach lurched. For a moment he kept moving, kept shielding civilians with his own body, even as crimson stained his uniform, but his steps faltered, his breath ragged. Something broke in her then. All her life she had dismissed men like him,
refused to see them, refused to respect them. Yet this man had carried others on his back, had shielded her with his body, had fought for people who didn't see him as anything more than a uniform. And now he was falling. "No," Isabella whispered, the word ripped from somewhere deep. She moved before she could think, bolting from cover despite bullets snapping overhead. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound. His blood was hot and slick against her palms, her silk blouse stained instantly. "Keep moving, Monroe," Marcus gritted, trying to push her away. "No," her voice cracked with desperation. "You're not dying, not for me." His eyes locked on hers, dark and unreadable. For a moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, he accepted it. No words, no thanks. Just a single nod. It was enough. For the first time, Isabella Monroe understood that strength wasn't privilege, wealth, or status. Strength was sacrifice. Strength was him. And for the first time, she was terrified of losing it.
The night pressed against the group like a suffocating blanket. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound threatened death. Isabella Monroe sat with her knees tucked to her chest near the jagged wall of a collapsed building, her body aching with exhaustion. Dust clung to her hair and skin, dulling the sheen that once made her glow in the ballroom light. She should have been asleep like the others, but her mind churned too violently for rest. Across the makeshift camp, Sergeant Marcus Washington crouched beside a wounded civilian, his big hands working with surprising gentleness as he wrapped a torn strip of cloth around the man's leg. His face was unreadable in the flickering glow of a dying flashlight, his focus unshakable. He had been like this since the ambush, checking wounds, reinforcing defenses, making sure no one strayed into the dark. Isabella stared at him longer than she intended. It unsettled her. When she first saw him, she saw only what she had been taught to see. A man out of place, someone who didn't belong in command, someone she refused to respect. Yet over the past hours, she had watched him bear the weight of men and women who couldn't walk, share what little food remained, and lead them through streets that had turned into hunting grounds. He had not once faltered. And worse, he had not once asked for thanks. Isabella looked down at her hands. The memory of his blood still lingered there, dark stains etched into her palms. She had pressed them against his wound, refusing to let him fall. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. She had acted not out of obligation, but desperation, because she had realized, too late perhaps, that she didn't want to lose him. That thought frightened her. She had lived her entire life believing men like Marcus were beneath her. Her father's dinner parties had been full of powerful white men in pressed suits, and the occasional black man who appeared was always there to serve, never to speak. Her world had been built on subtle dismissals, on jokes told in whispers, on the silent rule that certain people stayed in their place. She never questioned it because she didn't need to. It had protected her, cocooned her. Until now. Now the man who had kept her alive was the same kind that she had been raised to dismiss, and she didn't know what to do with that. Marcus finally moved away from the wounded civilian, rolling his broad shoulders as if trying to shake off exhaustion. He scanned the camp, his eyes sweeping over every soul to ensure they were safe. Then, after a long moment, he sank down against the wall a few feet from Isabella. His rifle rested across his lap, his eyes alert, even as his body begged for rest. Isabella hesitated, her throat dry. She reached into her bag and pulled out her canteen. It was nearly empty, just a swallow left, but she hadn't seen him drink in hours. Her fingers trembled as she held it out toward him. Marcus glanced at it, then at her. For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then he reached out and took it, his calloused hands brushing against her softer ones. He raised the canteen, drank a single swallow, and handed it back. No words, no thanks, just a nod. It was a simple gesture, but to Isabella it felt monumental. She exhaled shakily, lowering her gaze to the dirt. For the first time, she didn't see him as an enemy, didn't see him as a symbol of everything she had been taught to disdain. She saw him as a man A good man. The night stretched long. Gunfire cracked distantly, a grim reminder that safety was still miles away. One by one, the civilians drifted into an uneasy sleep. The soldiers formed a perimeter, eyes sharp, weapons ready. Isabella stayed awake, restless. She stole glances at Marcus, noting how his posture never truly relaxed. Even in exhaustion, he remained vigilant, as though the weight that every life here rested squarely on his shoulders. Finally, she found the courage to speak. "You haven't rested," she whispered. Marcus didn't look at her. "Rest comes later." "You'll collapse before then." His jaw flexed. "Not if they need me." Isabella frowned, hugging her knees tighter. "Why do you do it? You barely know these people." At that, he did look at her. His eyes were dark, steady, unwavering. "Because they're human, and humans deserve to live." Her stomach twisted. The simplicity of his words cut deeper than any lecture could. She had lived her life believing worth was measured in pedigree, in wealth, in power. But here he was, bleeding and exhausted, still fighting for strangers who would never remember his name. She had never known strength like that. The hours crawled on. At one point, a baby cried weakly in the arms of its mother, and Marcus rose without hesitation, digging into his pack to find the last scrap of food he had kept for himself. He handed it over quietly, with no expectation of gratitude. The mother wept silently, clutching the crumbs as if they were gold. Isabella's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge what she was seeing, but the words stuck. Pride and shame warred inside her, neither yielding. Instead, she simply watched. And the longer she watched, the more the cracks widened inside her. She thought of her father, of the conversations at his dinner table, of the sneers and smirks aimed at men like Marcus. She thought of the time she had laughed along, complicit without realizing it. She thought of how she had refused to trust him only hours ago, refused to even acknowledge his authority because of the color of his skin. And now, she thought of how many lives he had saved, including hers. Her certainty, her carefully constructed belief in her own superiority, was crumbling, and in its place was something far more dangerous: respect. Dawn broke slow and gray, painting the ruins in pale light. The group stirred awake, groaning as sore muscles protested another day of walking. Marcus rose immediately, his body weary but his eyes still sharp. He gathered the civilians, outlining the path ahead with calm authority. His voice steadied them, gave them focus. Even the soldiers listened, hanging on his every word. Isabella stood at the edge of the camp, arms crossed, pretending not to watch him, but she did. She couldn't stop herself. When he finished, he caught her gaze for a fleeting second. Just the second. But it was enough. Enough to tell her that he saw through her. Enough to remind her that he hadn't forgotten her hesitation, her prejudice, her contempt. But also enough to show her that none of it mattered now. He would protect her anyway. And that truth was more humbling than any insult could have been. For the first time in her life, Isabella Monroe wondered if everything she had been taught about men like Marcus, about people like him, had been a lie all along. And that thought haunted her more than the war itself.
The sun climbed high and merciless, pouring heat into the broken skeleton of the city. The group moved in weary silence, their footsteps crunching over glass and rubble, their shadows stretching long against gutted storefronts. Each block felt heavier than the last, every breath thick with smoke and the sour stench of decay. Isabella Monroe trudged at the rear of the civilians, her silk blouse clinging to her damp skin, her curves aching from fatigue. She had lost track of time, days blurred into one endless march of fear and sweat. But she knew one thing with certainty. She no longer doubted Marcus Washington. She followed him without hesitation now. When he raised a fist, she stopped. When he motioned forward, she moved. When he glanced back, scanning the civilians, she felt an unexpected comfort. The resentment she once carried, the poison of her upbringing, the prejudice that had shaped her, still flickered inside her, but weaker now, like an old ember fading against the flame of reality. Marcus walked ahead with his rifle across his chest, posture relaxed but coiled with vigilance. He had become the axis of their survival, the gravity holding the scattered fragments of humanity together. Even the other soldiers, white and black alike, deferred to his judgment. Isabella couldn't ignore it anymore. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a leader. And against her will, she respected him. The city shifted as they moved deeper into its ruins. Windows gaped open like empty eyes, curtains flapping in the hot wind. Abandoned cars littered the road, some scorched black, others riddled with bullet holes. The silence was wrong, too complete. Marcus's hand went up. The group froze. His head tilted, listening. Isabella held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears. Then, chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked from the rooftops, deafening in the canyon of buildings. Bullets spat sparks against rusted metal and shattered stone. Civilians screamed, scattering for cover. Soldiers returned fire, their rifles stuttering thunder into the sky. "Move!" Marcus bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Find cover, low and fast." Isabella dove behind an overturned crate, her hands trembling. The world was a blur of dust and screams, heat and sound. Her breath came shallow, panic clawing at her throat. She wanted to vanish, to rewind time, to pretend she was anywhere but here. But Marcus was already moving. She watched him cut through the storm like it bent around him. He pulled a teenager by the collar, shoving the boy behind a car. He barked orders to his men, his voice steady and commanding. He returned fire with precision, every shot deliberate. He was tireless, unstoppable. Until he wasn't. A sharp crack split the chaos. Marcus jerked, his body twisting as the bullet struck his side. Isabella's breath caught. He staggered, crimson spreading across his uniform, but he didn't stop. He gritted his teeth, raised his rifle again, and kept firing even as blood seeped down his ribs. Isabella's stomach lurched. Something inside her shattered. For hours, days, she had watched him carry them, shield them, fight for them. She had told herself she didn't care, that he was just doing his duty, but seeing him stumble, seeing him bleed, it tore through every wall she had built around herself. "No," she whispered. "No, no!" Her body moved before her mind caught up. She broke from cover, sprinting across the open space, despite bullets snapping around her. Soldiers shouted her to stop, but she didn't hear them. She dropped to her knees beside Marcus just as his legs faltered. "Stay down," he growled, trying to push her away. "No," she snapped, pressing her hands to his wound. Hot blood coated her fingers, sticky and terrifying. Her heart raced. "You're not dying, not from me." His eyes locked on hers, dark and burning with a mix of pain and stubbornness. For a long moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade. He was the soldier who had shielded her with his body, the man who had carried strangers on his back, the leader who had never asked for thanks. And she was the woman who had once dismissed him, who had believed herself superior to him. The weight of it crushed her. "I was wrong," she whispered, pressing harder against the wound, her voice trembling with guilt and fear. "God, I was wrong about you." Something flickered in his gaze then. Surprise, understanding, maybe even respect. But he didn't answer. He didn't need to. The firefight raged on. Soldiers shouted, bullets cracked, grenades shook the earth. But Isabella hardly heard any of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the man bleeding beneath her hands. And then the sound came, a low, steady thrum that built into a roar. Helicopter blades slicing the sky. Rescue. The evac team descended in a flurry of shouts and orders. Medics rushed forward, pulling Marcus onto a stretcher. Isabella stumbled back, her hands slick with his blood, her chest heaving. He caught her gaze as they lifted him. Even through the haze of pain, his eyes were steady. "You'll be safe now," he said, voice raw. He wasn't expecting anything in return. He never had. But Isabella's throat burned with words she had never thought she'd say. "I was wrong about you," she whispered, her voice breaking. His eyes softened, just for a moment, before he was carried toward the waiting helicopter. Isabella stood frozen, trembling. The woman who once refused to take his orders, the woman who once believed herself untouchable, now felt her world tilt without him. She was safe now. She could walk away, return to her world of privilege and polished lies. But the thought of leaving him behind sent a sharp ache through her chest. Because this man, the one she had misjudged, dismissed, even resented, had become the only person she truly trusted. And for the first time in her life, Isabella Monroe realized that love didn't come from pedigree or status. It came from sacrifice, from dignity, from strength, from him.
The helicopter thundered above, its blades slicing the smoke-thick sky. Soldiers rushed through the dust, guiding civilians toward the transport zone, shouting orders that cut through the chaos. For most, it was the sound of salvation. For Isabella Monroe, it was the sound of dread. She should have felt relief. She had dreamed of this moment for days, rescue, escape, the promise of her life resuming where it had left off. The thought of returning to her penthouse apartment, her soft silk sheets, and a city untouched by war should have filled her with joy. But her eyes weren't on the helicopters or the soldiers calling her forward. They were on him. Sergeant Marcus Washington lay on a stretcher surrounded by medics. His uniform was torn and soaked with his blood, his broad chest rising in uneven gasps. His face, always so steady, was pale beneath the grime. Wires and tubes snaked from his body as the medics barked urgent codes. He didn't flinch. He didn't complain. Even bleeding, he carried his pain with the same dignity he carried everything. Isabella's legs carried her before her mind caught up. She stumbled through the crowd, ignoring the hands tugging her toward safety, until she reached his side. He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes flickering open. For the first time since she'd met him, they looked clouded. Yet when they found her, there was still recognition, still steadiness. "You'll be safe now," he rasped. The words pierced her. He had nearly died shielding her, and still his concern was for her safety, not his own, never his own. Her throat tightened. She bent low, her voice trembling as tears stung her eyes. "I was wrong about you." For the briefest second, surprise flashed across his face. Then his expression softened into something unreadable, pain perhaps, but also something gentler. He gave her the smallest of nods before the medics lifted the stretcher and carried him toward the helicopter. The flight was a blur. Civilians huddled in fear, soldiers slumped in exhaustion, and the city shrank beneath them like a nightmare receding into memory. Isabella sat stiffly on the metal bench, her hands still stained with his blood, her eyes locked on the medics who worked furiously to keep Marcus stable. Every vibration of the helicopter rattled through her bones. She thought of every time she had dismissed him, every sneer she had given, every moment she had refused to see him. Shame burned in her chest like fire.
How blind she had been. When the helicopter touched down at the secure evacuation base, Marcus was whisked away on a stretcher. The medic shouted for blood, for plasma, for a surgeon. Isabella tried to follow, but a soldier blocked her path. "Ma'am, you need to check in. They'll take care of him." She wanted to scream, "I don't care about me," but the words caught in her throat. The soldier guided her toward the processing tent, where aid workers pressed blankets around her shoulders and asked for her passport. She answered numbly, her gaze drifting again and again toward the medical tent where Marcus had disappeared. Days later, Isabella sat in the quiet luxury of her Manhattan apartment. The city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass windows, glittering with the same indifference it always had. The silk sheets lay untouched on her bed. The polished marble floors gleamed beneath her feet. Everything was the same, except her. She sat with the television remote in hand, the news flickering across the screen. Reports of the war-torn country filled the broadcast, footage of soldiers patrolling ruined streets, convoys evacuating civilians, smoke curling above shattered buildings. To most viewers, the soldiers were faceless, uniforms, background noise to the tragedy of war. Not to her. She could still see him, the unwavering stance, the sharp eyes, the steady hands that pulled her to safety time and time again. She could still feel the weight of his body shielding hers, the sound of his voice commanding her to live. She thought about how many times she had misjudged men like him, how many times she had looked through them, not at them, how easily she had dismissed their worth. And now, after all she had seen, she knew better. Strength wasn't money or power or pedigree. Strength was sacrifice. Strength was carrying others when you could barely stand yourself. Strength was protecting people who didn't deserve it because it was the right thing to do. Strength was Marcus Washington. Her phone buzzed against the glass table, startling her. She picked it up, expecting another hollow message from an acquaintance eager for gossip about her ordeal. But the screen showed a number she didn't recognize. Her breath caught. As she opened it, "Hope you're safe." Her heart pounded. Slowly, a smile touched her lips. He was alive. The days that followed blurred into one another, but Isabella couldn't return to who she had been. She walked through her world of wealth and privilege like a ghost, everything muted compared to what she had lived. Dinner parties bored her, small talk grated on her, and the laughter of people untouched by hardship felt hollow. She had been changed. At night she dreamed of him, the way he had carried a collapsed old man without hesitation, the way he had found food for starving children, the way he had led his men with calm authority. She dreamed of his eyes meeting hers in the chaos, steady and unyielding, the only anchor she had left. And in the quiet hours of the morning, she admitted to herself what she could no longer deny. She loved him. Not because he had saved her life, not because he had been her protector, but because he had shown her what dignity looked like in the face of hate, what courage looked like in the shadow of death, what true strength looked like when the world was falling apart. And she, who had once believed herself superior, had been humbled. Weeks later, as autumn settled over New York, Isabella stood on the balcony of her apartment, the city stretching out beneath her like a glittering promise. She held her phone in her hand, scrolling back to that single message, "Hope you're safe." Her fingers trembled as she typed, then paused. The old Isabella, the one who believed in appearances and rules of class, would have deleted the words, pretended the moment had never existed. But she wasn't that woman anymore. So she pressed send. "I'm safe, but not without you." The screen stayed silent, but her heart felt lighter than it had for years. Isabella Monroe had once been blind, her world narrowed by prejudice and privilege. She had once believed love was about shared status, familiar faces, and pedigree. Now she knew the truth. Love was about character, about sacrifice, about seeing someone clearly for the first time and realizing they were everything you never knew you needed. And she had found that love, not in the glittering halls of her father's world, but in the ruins of a war-torn city, in the arms of the man she had once refused to trust. A man who had shown her what it meant to be human. A man she could never forget. Sergeant Marcus Washington. The city moved on around her. Life returned to its rhythm, but Isabella Monroe would never be the same, because she had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth, and she had chosen to embrace it. She was a racist, until she fell for the black soldier who saved her. And in loving him, she had found herself.